Hi, everyone.
Welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for attending today's CFE community chat. This is our 16th chat since April, and the 6th one of our fall engagement series, and actually the last one of our fall engagement series. So we'll be continuing on with a winter engagement series and hopefully beyond that. But we are excited to sort of wrap up our series for the fall with this particular presentation today. We know how incredibly busy and exhausted you must be after work every single day, especially during this time of year and especially during this particular year. And we're just so grateful that you chose to spend some time with us this afternoon. So for those of you who are new to CFE, I'm Sarah Hoppy-Knight. I'm the co-executive director of the organization. We're a Chicago-based education nonprofit that's been around for over 36 years, supporting and funding CPS educators so that they can best serve their students and grow in their profession. In a typical school year, which this is not clearly, we award about 400 grants and fellowships to CPS pre-K through 12th grade educators. So if you want to know more about us, please feel free to reach out to us after the presentation today. A few sort of housekeeping notes before we get started. If you could mute your microphones throughout the meeting, well, it'll be fairly informal, so there'll be opportunities to ask questions and we'll be having some conversations in the chat, but just to mute the background noise when Dr. Thomas is speaking, that would be great. And if you do have questions during the presentation, feel free to pop them in the chat box. So you can privately message me, again, Sarah Hoppy-Knight, or you can just put them out to everybody and I'll sort of keep track of them. The session is being recorded, just so that you know. And the recording will be posted along with the PowerPoint, the slide deck, and any associated resources on our website before the weekend. And also keep an eye out in that chat box for helpful information and messages sent by myself and Jamila, my teammate who's on the call. And that's about it for that. So let's get into it. Our presenter today is Dr. Marshall Thomas. He's the founder of Enact Academy, which helps organizations shift to remote learning and provides online work-embedded graduate courses for educators. Previously, Dr. Thomas was an assistant professor and the founding director of the Division of Basic Sciences at UGHE, a new university in Rwanda. And he developed innovative online programs at Harvard University. He earned his PhD in biology at Harvard and completed a postdoctoral fellowship in online education, also at Harvard University. Dr. Thomas has authored many peer-reviewed research papers and reviews in the fields of education research, immunology, and publishing trends in education and the biomedical sciences. He's quite the accomplished guy, and we are so thrilled to have him with us today. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Thomas.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I'm very humbled by the introduction, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you today. Maybe you heard some of the introductory music that was sort of conflicting with Sarah at the beginning, and by way of explanation, that is a song called Moto Perpetuo, or Perpetual Motion, which I think is a nice reference to how it must feel to be a teacher in 2020. But also it's famous for being very technically challenging to play. And that also speaks to the technical audacity that all of you have to display in order to do your jobs every day. So it's really my attempt to give a tribute to how hard all of you are working right now. Before we start and go into activities, which are really going to launch this discussion today, I'd like for all of you to take a moment to reflect on the challenges that you're facing right now in teaching online, and just share some of those challenges in the chat. So I'm going to put instructions here in the chat, but my request would be reflect on a challenge that you're facing right now and just share that in the chat. So it could be related to anything in teaching online. It would be very helpful to hear your thoughts on that. So I'll pause here for a moment, and I can wait as long as it takes, but please share your thoughts in the chat. Okay, students, even adults who have no internet access, from Dan. That's a really huge challenge. I'll be very upfront with all of you. we're focused on teaching practices today, so we may not get into questions around internet access and equity, although we will talk about this a little bit. Tracy mentions personal interactions. Such a huge element of the emotional component of a learning experience has to do with interacting with other learners, interacting with teachers. And indeed, it is one of the hallmarks that we talk about is fostering interpersonal interactions in learning online. Burnout from screens is a huge one. Thinking about ways to develop asynchronous activities that can be done with the screens closed down can be a helpful way. Thinking about those almost like homework assignments can be a helpful way to reduce screen time, and also thinking about varying activities so that students aren't engaged always in Zoom. We see that from Dan as well. Lack of interactive, engaging sessions, also from Dan, and attendance issues and relationship building for after-school programming from Asia. Thank you very much for that. Attendance is a big problem, big challenge. And what we're going to talk about is some strategies that will help students to remain engaged and motivated in a learning setting online that might help with some of those attendance challenges. So now, before we actually go into some of the more didactic components, I would like for all of you to start with another reflection. And this is actually going to be structured as a small breakout activity. The way this is going to work is I'll ask you to reflect on learning experiences that you've had in the past that were very impactful or engaging for you personally as learners, not necessarily as teachers. So reflect on a learning experience that was really meaningful for you. And then you're going to just share that with the other individuals in the breakout room. So the way this will work is you'll go into breakouts of 2 to 3. First, you just introduce yourselves so that we're sure that everyone knows each other. And then you'll take about a minute to describe a learning experience that you had that was very impactful for you. And what about that learning experience was so impactful and engaging. So just to make sure that everyone's on the same page, I'm again going to put instructions in the chat. And I'll ask, are there any questions about this activity? Can I get a thumbs up if the activity itself is clear? Okay, great. And now, let's see, I will ask Jamila if you could set up those breakout rooms with groups of 2 to 3. And because we're a small group here, we'll ask all of you to go into your breakouts because there'll be somebody waiting in that room to have this discussion with you. So Jamila, if you can just let me know when those are ready. And again, it'll be about 4 or 5 minutes total. And we'll try to send you a message when you're in the breakout rooms, when you've got about a minute left, so you know to start to wrap up. You should be seeing an invitation to join your breakout rooms now. I'll ask you to jump into those. We'll see you soon. Thank you. Jamila, I'm going to stay out here in the main room. And if folks can't join their breakout rooms, they're welcome to share their thoughts on this question in the large group setting. So Asia, if you're not able to join the breakout room, you could share an experience that was very impactful for you as a learner. And same actually for Sarah and KJ. It would be great to hear from you. Hi, KJ. We haven't met yet.
Hi,
We were trying to introduce
there we
you
go.
earlier.
Hi.
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 Good to meet you.
You too. Thank you so much for doing this. I actually wanted to ask you, I've been talking with a lot of principal friends of mine, and they're preparing for when school comes back into session, working with kids who have a huge achievement gap and the panic and the worry that people are feeling. And so a lot of them, especially the parochial or the private schools, are doing a ton of prep work for the social emotional stuff. And I'm wondering, obviously we have like 2 minutes to talk here, but I'd love to be able to follow up with you, like with an email with a couple of questions, just to like pick your brain a bit on that.
Sure. I want to be transparent in what I know and what I don't know. I think social emotional learning isn't my area of expertise, but I might have some thoughts for you in terms of approaches to implement online. And actually, the second part of this presentation, we talk a little bit about goal setting and motivational oriented interventions that actually might be applicable for learners, especially those who are kind of falling behind or where there's an opportunity gap. And so you may find some of the resources that we talk about today to be applicable to those groups that you're working with.
Oh, that would be great. I appreciate you. Where are you right now physically?
I am based just outside of Boston in Massachusetts. So,
okay.
So it's past 5 o'clock here. So eager to be wrapping up the day, but
Yeah.
also glad to be with all of you.
Yay. Okay, one more thing I'll ask.
Sure.
Are people wearing their masks and staying away from each other? Damn it.
Now, are you experiencing those challenges in your area as well?
Well, at like the grocery store, most people, there's some under the nose people that makes me crazy, but it's out like socially, people having gatherings and.
Yeah, it's a big challenge. It's a big challenge. I see we've got a couple folks joining us, so I'm just gonna explain to them what's going on now so that they're not completely confused by the circumstances. We have folks in breakout groups right now, Krista and Jane, and we see you've just joined. They're talking about a learning experience for them that was particularly memorable and impactful. And so we have about 1.5 minutes left in the breakout. So if either of you would like to share a learning experience of your own that is very memorable and impactful for you, it'd be great to hear about that before the breakout groups come back. And I'm sorry to interrupt you, KJ, but just wanted to make sure our new participants have a sense for what's going on here. And Jamila, if you're able to send a message to the breakouts that they should come back in about 1 minute, that'd be great, if you're able to hear me. Jamila, is that? Oh, great. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I was trying to type it.
Oh, no problem. I just wanted to make sure you heard me. Sometimes it's hard to tell with the mute and everything. And when you bring them back, you can set the timer to be, I think the default is 1 minute, but we can make it, 15 seconds or something like that, because 1 minute seems like it goes on forever. So in the 30 seconds that we have left, any questions before the group comes back? I'm going to just go right into discussion of what happened in the breakouts. So.
No, but I really like this structure. I think we mentioned it to you, but we haven't done it like this. We've never done breakout rooms, and I think we'll see when they come back. But like,
yeah, we'll see. We'll see. I've done this particular activity with a few different groups, not always in breakouts, and it's always, well, we'll talk about the reasons that I do it when folks come back. I think you can start to call folks back now, Jamila. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamila.
And so Krista and Asia, we're going to be bringing folks back right now. Welcome back. Hi, Mary. Hi, Tracy. As folks are rejoining us from the breakouts, what we'll do is just ask each of you to perhaps share some of the experiences that you talked about, even if it's briefly. Just share an experience or two that a learning experience that was particularly impactful for you, and be happy to take a volunteer. I see Dan has come off mute. You ready to share, Dan?
I thought I was clicking mute. I'm sorry.
Well, we're looking for folks to share the experience that they discussed in the breakout room. So if you're volunteering, that'd be great.
Well, let me ask my group mates if my story was worth sharing. Yolanda, was it worth sharing?
Yes, it was. Yes.
Okay. All right. Then I will share. Thank you. So this was 2 years ago, and it was not in a classroom, but in a big conference room. And I worked for McGraw-Hill at the time, a very progressive thinking company. They brought in all of the managers for a day of PD, and they brought in Glenn Singleton. And if you don't know Glenn, he wrote a book called Courageous Conversations About Race. And one of the activities that he had us do about halfway through the day was he pointed to the right wall of the room and the left wall. And it was just basically, you have to get up and put yourself somewhere in the room. If you were of the belief that things had improved for Black Americans in this country, go stand on the right side of the wall, room, up against the wall. And if they had not improved at all, go stand on the left wall. And if you're somewhere in between, then put yourself in that spot in the room. And like I said, a very diverse audience, a couple hundred people. And, you know, in my mind and based on my experiences, my way of thinking, I thought, you know, things are not good, but they must be better. So I go stand on the right wall. And there were people all throughout the room in different spots, but you know, every African-American that was part of that group was against the left wall. And you know, what I mentioned to my group was, you know, for the last several years, I've been on a journey of educating myself and going back and you know, reading Ta-Nehisi Coates and reading John Lewis's biography and reading just reading a lot of books and trying to learn what I missed in my lifetime that I should have known about and just didn't. And that was opening educational activity.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Dan. And one of the things that I wanted to do here is just to reflect on some of the themes from the experiences shared. And you talked about an experience that's very emotional and that also connected directly to the personal experiences of others and helped you to build a connection with those others. So every learning situation is going to be a little bit different, but there are some of these underlying themes, like a learning experience that makes us empathize with others. That's really powerful. Maybe I'll ask for one or two other folks to share their particular experience before we move on. And I promise you that I have there's a reason that we're doing this activity. Any other volunteers would like to share an experience, perhaps something that is, you know, very unique to you or different from the experience that was shared? And thank you for courageously volunteering to share, Dan.
Was that a courageous conversation?
Well, I certainly appreciate your sharing your experience. Can we have another volunteer? I'm happy to sit here longer.
I'll quickly state that Tracy had some nice comments to say about how a science teacher prefers to teach science with tactile resources and where you're really doing things with the children. And yet her online has been also lots of positives, because she said some of the quiet students are finding that they kind of like this type of learning. So I thought that was a fun thing to hear of what you're missing about online teaching and what you like about online teaching. Okay, that's great. That relates to a couple of themes here. First of all, that when we have learning experiences that are applied, where we're actually doing something that connects directly to the learning, that can lead to learning. So that was an advantage of in person. But then also, when there are opportunities for us to participate, to engage directly with the learning, individual students, that also can lead to high quality learning, which is a feature of good can be a feature of good online learning. So again, there's some underlying themes there. One more person willing to share, and then we'll move on. Thank you for sharing, Mary. I appreciate that. In particular, anyone who has an experience that was very memorable for them, a learning experience that was very memorable for them. I know you're all not shy because you're teaching all the time, so.
Hi,
Hi, Cynthia.
Hi, I will share. I share with my group that in college, in the Methods of Teaching Science class, our professor required that we read a biography from a scientist of color. And then we had to come in and present experiments to our classmates while in character as that scientist. And it was just something that stayed with me. I mean, he was just a wonderful methods teacher. So.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. And
Okay.
it brings in another theme for me, which is that sometimes it can be really important to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes, and role playing can be a very powerful way to do that. So now, why did I make us all go through this experience of sharing, impactful, powerful learning experiences of our own? Maybe I had 3 reasons. First of all, would be that right now is a challenging time, and I think it's important to remember some of the joys of learning. So thinking about a positive experience is just one way for us to do that, and reflecting on that experience. Secondly, I have found that in an activity like this, there can be a lot of debate about cameras, about using cameras or not. But I would suspect that when you were in your breakout rooms, you turned on your cameras and you were talking to each other face to face, and we saw that some folks came back with their cameras on. And so there's this debate, do we require cameras or not? There's a middle path, which is just to develop activities that encourage folks to turn on their cameras. And that can be a gentler way to introduce more of that personal interaction. And then third of all, there's a theme that relates to online learning, which is that when we talk about teaching and learning online, you'll often hear people say, don't just take what you're doing in person and translate it into online learning. And I think that that is absolutely right. We can't cut and paste. But a lot of those underlying principles, whether it's about forming emotional connections, interpersonal connections, role playing, a lot of those underlying principles are kind of shared or conserved between teaching and learning in person and teaching and learning online. And so that's really one of the purposes of that activity there, is to help us think about ways that we can look for those themes about what unifies great teaching and apply them to our practice of teaching online. So with that, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into part of the session that's a little bit more didactic, where I'm going to be sharing some information with all of you. But before we do that, we're going to transition into the approach that we're going to use. So first, let me just confirm that you're able to see my screen. Can I get a thumbs up or a yes, a heck yes from, okay, thank you, Sarah, appreciate that. So one more participatory question for all of you before we delve into that portion. How do you think of ways to support students who have a higher chance of some adverse academic outcomes online? That could be dropping out, not showing up to class, failing. What are the strategies that you use or that you have found effective for supporting those students? And once again, I'm just going to ask you to share your thoughts in the chat box. Okay, praise participatory behavior is a comment from Emma. So praising that behavior as opposed to, it's an interesting variation of growth mindset. Praising a positive behavior as opposed to praising, oh, you did really good work here. It's related to the effort of participating in class. I like that a lot. One-to-one conversations about needs and feelings, coming from Tracy. This is an interesting idea, and also it relates to the concept of reaching out individually to students who are struggling or who aren't showing up. That can be really powerful to show that there's somebody there who cares and who is really concerned about their success. Nicole's mentioning keeping content fresh, interesting, and inclusive, and that relates to methods of engagement, which can be challenging online. It can be challenging to, and even awkward sometimes, to encourage real, authentic engagement online. And that keeping content fresh and looking for varying ways to engage your students is one way to do that. Getting to know students better can be a real challenge, but also a way to keep students engaged. I like that a lot. Giving students opportunities for voice is another really interesting concept, and it relates to autonomy and students' efficacy as learners and their control of their own learning experiences. So all these are really great suggestions and ideas. And some of these are things that we're going to talk about in this session today. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the approach that we use to think about this particular problem. So the framework that we use is called the Hallmarks of Great Online Learning. And really it's a research-backed or an evidence-backed approach to looking at the elements of student engagement and success in online learning. So all the principles that we're going to talk about today have supporting evidence from the research that shows that they either improve student engagement or student learning in an online or blended setting. Everything that we talk about is also agnostic to technology. And so what I mean by that is that we're not advocating that you use a specific platform. This isn't about Google Classroom or Canvas or Schoology. This is about thinking about teaching practices and how they apply to technology. So first we talk about teaching practices, and then we look at the particular technologies that we can use in our schools. And we're focused mostly on practices for secondary teachers. And the reason for this actually relates to that first bullet point, which is research-backed practices. Unfortunately, until recently, there hasn't been much research on what is effective for elementary learners in an online setting. So we kind of have to make the choice to focus on practices for grades 6 to 12. And that's informed by research from higher education and from secondary school settings. And because we're just together for an hour today, I'm only going to be talking about 2 particular examples of these hallmarks. There are 7 different practices that we focus on in total, and I'll give you more information about where you can read more or learn more about those. But the 2 examples that we're going to give are going to follow this framework: research-backed, technology agnostic, and focus on a secondary audience. So the last thing I want to mention before we move into this presentation is that this is not the answer. What I mean is that we're talking just about teaching practices. We had somebody mention challenges of devices and internet access in the beginning of the discussion around the challenges that their students face. We can't just look at teaching practices as the sole entry point into creating equitable and inclusive online learning experiences. We have to think about this in a 360-degree fashion. So that is student nutrition, support for the home environment for the family, access to devices and technology, training to use those devices and technology. And I know many school leaders, many teachers have been really concerned with a lot of those issues today. So just for the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to be focused on teaching practices, and that's just because that's our particular area of focus. That's not to say that those other areas are not important. So we're going to start with one of the hallmarks that's really simple. And the reason I say it's simple is it's something that I hope that all of you could think about and potentially start to reflect into your own practice right away. And then the second hallmark is a little bit more of a reach, and it may involve a little bit more work. But this hallmark is that great online learning is organized. It's going to seem very, very simple, very straightforward. And we're going to talk about some of the supporting research evidence and then how you can reflect this forward into your own practice. So we are actually going to look at a little tidbit or a snippet of research. And before we talk about the research, I want to use an analogy to describe why it's so challenging to understand organization or to study scientifically organization in online courses. And that is that basically a teacher who creates an organized course is also going to be creating a course that probably has well thought out learning objectives and activities and assignments that are carefully aligned to those objectives, et cetera, et cetera. So course organization is correlated with a well-designed course, with a thoughtfully laid out course. In the same sense, it's a little bit like human diet. A person who eats a healthy diet is probably also getting lots of exercise, engaging in healthy activities. So diet is correlated with lifestyle. Organized courses are correlated with organized, thoughtful, well laid out teaching. And so it's very difficult to say, okay, this is specifically because it was easy to navigate this course that students had good outcomes. And so just as we think about studying human diet, the gold standard here is an experimental study. What I mean by that is that usually you have some kind of control group, which might be an organized course, and an experimental group, which is a disorganized version of that same course, and we compare outcomes in those 2 groups. And so that's exactly what we're going to look at here. The last concept that I need to introduce here is this idea of findability. And really what that means is exactly what it sounds like. It means that it's easy to find materials in an online course, easy to navigate through that course, easy to know what to do next, easy to submit assignments, et cetera, et cetera. Some ways to think about this might be the number of clicks. How many clicks do you have to go through to get to materials? How confused are you in the process of finding materials? So we're going to be looking at 2 different courses that have the same backbone. The original course is a course that was found to have high findability. So the group Quality Matters, which many of you are probably familiar with, has a rubric that allows us to rate how findable materials are in courses. The original course, it's very easy to find your way around this course. Now, the researchers took this course and systematically broke it in a few ways. Specifically, they made it harder to find materials in the course, harder to find assignments, harder to know what to do next, harder to submit those materials. Everything else is exactly the same. All the content is the same. And then they had some go through the original course. Some participants went through the original course. Some went through the low findability version of that course. And they had to complete 7 different tasks in each of these courses. The tasks are the same. And they completed a survey beforehand, a little mini survey after each task, and a survey at the end. And so obviously we're going to be looking at how participants fared in this original course where it's easy to find materials versus this other course where it's harder to find materials. And one of the principal factors that the researchers looked at here is this concept of online self-efficacy. This is basically how confident we are in ourselves to be successful in an online learning experience. And so a learner who has high self-efficacy believes that they can complete this learning experience, and one with low self-efficacy may not. So those who went through the original course, the high findability course, they had high self-efficacy before they started doing these 7 different tasks in the course, and their self-efficacy was just as high after they finished these tasks. So there's no effect of taking the course on self-efficacy. But those who went through the low findability version of the course have this very major drop in their sense of self-efficacy. So why is this important? Self-efficacy is one of the strongest drivers of outcomes in an online setting. The belief that you can be successful actually impacts whether or not you will complete that online learning experience. So a learner who already has low self-efficacy is kind of has the highest chance of stopping when they get frustrated or confused. Whereas a learner who has really high self-efficacy is just going to keep going through it. So we make a learning experience that's really organized. That becomes a little bit of an equity issue. We're helping students who have low self-efficacy the most. And this carries into the specific experience that they felt as they were working in these courses. So if we compare after every task, they were asked, how frustrated do you feel? Those who went through the original course weren't feeling very frustrated. They reported low levels of frustration. But for every single activity, those in the low findability version of the course felt more frustrated. And that probably kind of builds up to reduce their feelings of self-efficacy, their confidence in their own ability to be successful in a particular online setting. So I'm just going to pause here and recap. Basically, we have a very, very simple change, which is making our learning experiences as organized as we can. That actually leads to a change in how students perceive their ability to be successful in an online setting. So with that, now I'm going to put it back to all of you and ask you what strategies you have used or you think you could use to make your learning more organized and keep students from getting frustrated in an online setting. And once again, I'll just ask you to share your thoughts in the chat. So again, the question is, what strategies have you used to keep your learning organized in an online setting or to prevent students from feeling frustrated? So we have a suggestion to keep the structure the same every day. This is great. This gets to one of the recommendations that I'm going to talk about in just a minute. But the idea of consistency, of predictability, that helps to reduce the cognitive load of knowing what to do. You can think about it, cognitive load as either being oriented towards the learning or oriented towards everything else. And the more cognitive load we can orient towards learning, the better the outcome is for the students. So thank you for sharing that suggestion. Can we hear a few more? Other ideas for keeping your learning experiences organized or ensuring high findability in online learning? Record lessons for students to refer back. Oh, I like this one. So this is a way for students to potentially engage at their own pace with, especially with content or instruction. I like that. Really interesting suggestion here. Preview the content from the viewpoint of the student. That's great. And another suggestion that I will talk about in a moment is the concept of actually swapping with a friend and asking your friend to look at your materials and you look at their materials. And we use this in technology development in terms of things like beta testing or user testing. We're much less biased when we're looking at somebody else's work than our own work because we're so familiar with our own work. That's a great suggestion. I see here another suggestion from Yolanda to use Google Slides with information and hyperlinks to move through the lesson. This is great. The idea of a single source of truth, a landing page where everything can be found. That's going to help students to know where to go next, to know what to do next. And that also imposes some linearity, right? You go from this slide to that slide, you do this first, then you do that. And I want to distinguish that from giving students choice. They can still have choice about how they're going to do an activity or what they're going to focus on, but making sure that they know what the instructions are can be helpful. Nicole has mentioned using Google Classroom to keep everything organized, creating a workflow deck, Bitmoji classrooms that help the visuals link to assignments and text. That's another great example. Another suggestion is to make an example available as students work through, sending a schedule to parents with links so that they know everything that's coming up. This relates to the idea of a checklist, which can be particularly helpful for younger learners, where every activity that the learner has to do is kind of delineated in that very linear fashion. So there's a lot of great suggestions here. Many of these suggestions are exactly the suggestions that I have in my slides. So I'm just going to put the slides up again. And I'll just ask for a thumbs up if you can see this, Sarah. Great, thank you. We've already talked about several of these, but the idea of having a landing page or a single source of truth, this could be that Google slide deck, this could be an Excel sheet, it could be anything that has everything in order that students need to do with links into those materials. Somebody mentioned the idea of doing the same thing every day. Having routines where students know what to expect, where they know what software to use, where they become comfortable with those tools. It's really helpful. I talked about checklists. We talked about asking a friend to look at materials or looking at materials with fresh eyes. The last thing that I'll mention is that this also relates to what we do in live synchronous classes. So you may have noticed that for every activity where possible, I've just pasted in the chat, here's what you should do. You know, you're going to discuss this, or here's the question that I'm posing. And the reason for that is that, you know, if you were looking at something else for a minute or just joining the call, you might not have those instructions. And also it gives everyone an opportunity to reread that if they need to. The more sophisticated version of this than what I've done, which is just a couple of sentences, is if you have a very involved activity, you could have a link to a document that explains the activity. Sometimes it's not enough to just talk about the activity and expect that students will be able to do it. It's helpful to reinforce that and provide really clear instructions. So if you're looking for more guidance like this, we have a document on our website that you can just go and download that goes through some of the supporting evidence for this hallmark, and then specific actions that you can take in order to improve organization of your online courses. So I'll pause there and just take a minute and see if there's any questions. You can turn on your mic or you can put them in chat.
On what website is that diagram that was just on the screen?
That's our organization's website is enactacademy.org, and you can go to the resources tab. And there's also links in the slides that Sarah will share. Sarah and her team will share tomorrow.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments before we go into the next hallmark? I want to be mindful of your time, and I know you're near the end of the day, so we've got about 20 minutes left. We'll take a look at the next hallmark, but please feel free to post comments or questions in chat as we go along, and we can come back to them at the end. As I said, this is a little bit more of a stretch. This relates to helping our students to remain engaged and motivated. And this is not a simple thing to do. So there are a lot of different approaches. And the approach that I'm going to talk about today involves helping students to set goals to remain engaged in an online learning experience. And we're going to relate that to some other concepts as well. So just like the last hallmark, I'm going to talk about one particular study that provides supporting evidence for how you can do this and how this works. So in this particular case, we're looking at students who are in an online psychology course and they're just out of high school. So maybe share some characteristics with your students and are a little older. They're first and second year students, and this is a year-long online psychology class. And the faculty in this course knew that there was a group of students who had a higher chance of failing or dropping out in this course. And so for us to understand this study, we need to look at what that subpopulation is. This was a diverse public university, so it had students from all different backgrounds, different levels of high school grades. And because they're psychologists, they're always giving their students these like funny psychology tests. And one of the tests that they gave them was to measure their optimism. And they found that students who came in with low grades from high school and had a low score on this optimism test had a higher chance of failing or dropping out. And so they were interested in developing an activity that would support these students in particular. So we're going to focus on an intervention made for those students. And they, being psychologists, were very interested in this question, looked into motivation and goal setting, and they decided to help these students to set academic goals and to work towards those goals. Just like the last study, this is experimental. So half the class is going to receive an activity that's the intervention, and half of the class will not. And the activity is really simple, but it's worth talking about how it worked. The first phase is activation. This involved thinking about past academic performance. So they just asked the students, how do you feel about your past academic performance? And this is a way to engage emotionally in this activity that's about to happen. The next step is something that's called induction. And this is more didactic. In this step, the students learned about strategies to set and work towards their academic goals. And so one class of strategies that we might think of is, oh, I'm just going to work harder on my goals. Like, I need to spend more time on my goals. The faculty decided to focus on something a little different here. They focused on strategies around how students think about their goals. So a specific example would be thinking about how important a goal is in terms of their future lives. And another specific example would be thinking about how good it would feel to achieve that goal. So this has to do more with how we think about goals and why they're important to us, and less with the behaviors of working towards those goals. And then finally, there's a consolidation phase, and this involves a writing exercise. The students were asked to set any academic goal that they wanted to, write that goal down, and then write about how they're going to work towards that goal. And specifically, they were asked to anticipate how good it would feel to achieve the goal, to anticipate how important that goal is for their future, and to think about the challenges that they would face along the way and how they're going to work through those challenges. So this whole activity takes about an hour in total. It's not very long. The other half of the class isn't in this intervention group, so they didn't do any activity. Everything else is the same though. They were in the same course, engaged with the same materials, etc. Now we're going to look at the end of the second semester, so more than 6 months later, at the outcomes for these students. So we're only going to look at students who had low grades, and we're going to start by looking at those with low optimism. These are in that group that had a higher chance of failing. So those who didn't do the intervention, about 60% of them did complete the course. So that means that they did all the assignments and they achieved a passing grade. This increases to 80% in the group that completed this activity. So just 1 hour of setting goals and writing about how they're going to work towards those goals really impacts the course completion rate for these students 6 months later. And this is a really big effect. As all of you know, we think about education, I certainly think about education as a cumulative process. It's something that builds up over minutes, hours, days, weeks, years. This is something that has a brief intervention with a lasting impact. And then for those in the high optimism but low grades group, this is a group that didn't have a higher chance of failing. And this intervention has no effect on their course completion rates. So once again, here we have an equity-oriented intervention that specifically helps students to remain engaged, remain motivated in an online learning setting. And my point here isn't that everyone should be doing this with their students. It's going to depend on the subpopulation of students that you work with. So the next question that I have here is just a simple poll question. And so I'll ask, actually I can put the poll question up. So the question is just, which of these challenges are your students facing? This is a select one answer, so you're going to have to choose if you feel your students face multiple challenges. Just to define some of these terms, stereotype threat is when a student is a member of a particular group that may have negative stereotypes about that group, and they may believe that those stereotypes could be true, and that affects their academic performance. Fixed academic mindset is this concept that a student can't grow academically and they believe that they are not able to improve their academic performance over time. And so just ask you to take a minute to fill this out. We'll try to get a majority of folks to respond, and then we'll share the results and we'll move on with the discussion. Okay, great. 5 more seconds if anyone else is eager to share. So now I'm going to end the poll and share the results. I hope you're able to see. All of you selected at least one of these is a challenge that your students currently face. I suspect that if you had the option to select multiple answers, many of you would have selected numerous answers for this. And so really my message here is that this type of activity can be oriented to the specific challenges that your student face, and it can include any of these 3 categories. We've already seen how an activity oriented towards setting goals can help students to remain engaged in an online class. And although they didn't look at attendance specifically, I suspect that an activity of goal setting would help students to continue to attend class. So you might consider an activity such as this one if your students are having trouble attending class. But there are also specific categories of activities that you could take for students who face stereotype threat or who have a fixed mindset. So I'm just going to talk about those activities here. There are interventions that are known as social belonging activities that help students who are from particular groups to really see themselves as learners first and foremost, and not to develop an academic identity that includes them. And so that's really important for a learner from a group where there might be some negative stereotypes, because they believe in themselves as a student and a learner, and also helps them to feel that they belong in this setting. And there are interventions oriented towards, actually can be given to all students, but help students to see themselves as academically oriented and able to succeed in this environment. Similarly, there are interventions oriented towards changing students' mindset, helping them to develop a growth mindset. These have been administered with really large groups of students, have been tested, and there are links to resources where you can find these toolkits and use them yourselves at the end of this presentation. And once again, they're very similar to the intervention that you just saw. They involve a little bit of activation, thinking about past performance, learning a little bit about strategies to remain engaged, and then writing about it. And so all of these activities share those features. And finally, you've already seen a class of activities oriented towards motivation that could be used for students to encourage them to remain engaged in an online setting. So now we're going to look at some of my advice around supporting students' self-efficacy in an online environment. You've already seen these brief intervention activities. As I said, there are more detailed resources in the links that I'll share that you could look into and see whether some of those toolkits or interventions would be appropriate for your students. Providing students with choice and letting them anchor their learning to the real world is a really great way for them to feel engaged and motivated in their learning. Allowing students to choose what they're going to do next helps to build their sense of autonomy as a learner. And then finally, this has come up before, but in the digital world, we're dealing with a learning curve. And so providing students with a lot of opportunities to practice the tools that they will use is going to build their self-efficacy as well. It basically, as they build digital fluency, they're going to become more comfortable and believe in themselves as successful online learners. And once again, this guidance is available in that same guidebook that I mentioned, and we have a link to the guidebook at the end. So are there any questions or comments about this particular section, about this hallmark of supporting student autonomy and self-efficacy? And again, you can type your comments in the chat if you have any comments or question, or you can come off mute. We will have one more opportunity for broader discussion at the end, so you can also save your comments until then if you would like. And in the meantime, I want to mention that engagement comes up again and again and again. So although we don't have time to talk about some of the research evidence behind strategies for student engagement, I also want to share some of my advice on student engagement. First of all, it can be very boring to sit through a lot of lecturing or videos in an online setting. So breaking up that didactic those didactic activities with other types of activities, such as even typing thoughts in chat, answering poll questions, breakouts. Those are ways to create a more engaging learning experience. I tend to recommend no more than 15 minutes of straight didactic without some kind of interaction. And the flip side of this is providing variation, giving students with multiple ways to engage with the content that aren't just a video or just a worksheet, but provide varied ways for learners to actually grapple with the material itself and also to express their learning. Giving students opportunities to set goals, as we've seen, can increase their engagement in an online setting and help them to see in the long term why they're showing up to this class that might feel a little awkward to be online, or they might feel bored. This helps them to see the longer term picture. And we also talked about strategies that involve breakouts that can nudge students to participate. So if you put students in breakout groups of 2, they're going to feel that they have to participate more so than in a larger group. And just doing as much as you can to personalize your outreach and interactions. So reaching out to individual students who are struggling, calling them if you need to. Those types of things can help students to remain engaged and to know that somebody cares about them. Here's the link that I mentioned to this guidebook that has all the 7 hallmarks of great online learning, all of our guidance on how to implement those hallmarks in your own classroom. Some of it isn't going to be right for your context. You're going to have to take a look at it and say, does this fit with the technologies that I use and the approaches that I use in my classroom? And also, is it right for the population of students that I'm working with? But this is a great resource for you to get started. And if you're really interested in this approach, this kind of research-backed teaching approach, we also have a graduate course, as Sarah mentioned at the outset. The next cohort of that is starting in January. And our approach in the course is very similar to what you've seen here. We talk about supporting research evidence behind different practices, and then how you can translate those practices into your classroom with a real focus on projects and work products that teachers create to actually use in their own teaching. So if you're interested in that, there's more information right on our website here. And then finally, I mentioned a couple of different resources along the way. There's this excellent website called PERTS that has all of these toolkits for activities that you can do with your students to work on growth mindset or social belonging. It can be really powerful for particular populations of learners. And they have actually published those tools. So you can go, you can download them, and you can implement them in your classroom. I believe they have a growth mindset toolkit for middle schoolers or for early high schoolers that has been tested in really large groups of students and has long-term impacts on academic outcomes. I found that in this pandemic context, that Edutopia is really valuable. There's a lot of very actionable guidance in the blogs that are posted there, teachers sharing their experiences and their tips and tools for making things work. So I would highly recommend that. And then Transcend Education has a lot of great research-backed resources on approaches that you can use to build greater engagement and greater learning in an online setting. And so with that, I would say thank you all. A couple of things that I didn't talk about today would be that really the big picture here is that we're all learning this together. There is no best practice in online learning for K through 12. There's only some evidence that we can apply in terms of what works. And really you are all building those practices now. So give yourselves permission for things not to be perfect. Know that it's all going to work out. And I'm always happy to answer questions if you'd like to shoot me an email. And I really appreciate your time today. And in the few minutes that we have left, I would like to share a survey that we have just on your experience today. You can give us feedback to see if we can improve. And I'm happy to stay on the line and discuss and answer any questions that you would have or hear any comments that folks have. And thank you, Sarah, and the rest of CFE for hosting me today. I really appreciate that.
Thanks, Marshall. Yes, if you do have questions, we're happy to stay on for a few minutes. You're welcome to unmute yourself and ask them verbally, or you can pop them in the chat. As you think, or kind of get ready to head off, please do make sure that you take a look at the survey that Marshall popped the link into the chat. if you have questions that weren't addressed and you don't have time or you don't feel comfortable asking them right now, as Marshall said, he gave you his email address, which was wonderful. You can also reach out to us if you have any questions that we can answer. If you also have ideas for future CFE community chats. So like I said, we've done just shy of 20 of these since April, and they've kind of run the gamut, so to speak, and we're always looking for new ideas. So if there's something that you wish that you had access to, if you have heard somebody speak and you'd like to introduce me to that person, we're always open to new ideas. So definitely shoot those my way. And if there's anything else you want to discuss with us, if you want to talk about CFE more, some of our other professional growth opportunities, our grants, please don't hesitate to reach out. So anyway, we are just so thankful for everything each and every one of you has been doing the past several months. Our team continues to be here for you in the days and weeks ahead. Who knows what that will bring, but we're here and we're doing it together, and we are just so thankful for you and all that you do. So we will stay on the line for a minute or so if there's anyone who would like to ask a question or make a comment. I will also be reaching out within the next couple of days with our own post survey and also the access to the recording and the slide deck and all the resources. So you'll have access to all of that. Marshall, thank you again. You were fantastic.
Well, thank you, everyone, and
yep,
thank you, Sarah.
Jolyn. All right. Okay, well, we wish you all wonderful evenings and happy holiday seasons. And again, don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything or want to talk to us about anything.